Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Heather Bromfield. I am with Enterprise Community Partners, and welcome to the role of the public sector in supporting preservation. Before we dive into today's presentation, I'm going to pass it over to Allison Singolani from SV at Home, to whom we're really grateful for sponsoring this Affordable Housing Month, and for your support on this event. So over to you, Allison.
Thanks so much, Heather. I'm really excited for a great conversation today. I'm Allison Singolani. I'm the Director of Policy with Silicon Valley at Home, who many of you know as SV at Home. We're really proud to be partnering with Enterprise Community Partners for Affordable Housing Month this May, because we're aligned in our commitment to ensuring that everyone in our community has access to safe, stable housing that they can afford. Affordable Housing Month is a great time to come together and learn and take action. And this year's theme is all in for housing. So it's a really powerful call for all of us to show up fully and commit to the work of housing justice. Real lasting change only happens when every voice, every organization, and every community member is fully invested. SV at Home leads this charge through policy advocacy, leadership development, coalition building, and amplifying the voices of those who are most impacted by our housing crisis. As partners, we're excited to be all in alongside Enterprise, learning from each other and taking meaningful steps toward a future where housing is a right and not a privilege. We invite you to learn more about SV at Home at svathome.org. We do have 56 events this Affordable Housing Month in Santa Clara County, between SV at Home hosted events and partner events. So there's still a lot of great opportunities to learn, engage, and connect. Please visit, and I'll drop a link in the chat, but siliconvalleyathome.org/events to check out the rest of the Affordable Housing Month events calendar. So much, I'll pass it back to you, Heather.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison. And before we dive into today's presentation, I also want to share briefly about Enterprise. We are a national affordable housing organization committed to increasing the availability of affordable housing and promoting upward mobility. Some of you might know us as a longtime CDFI lender, but in addition to that, Enterprise also conducts research, advocates for evidence-based affordable housing policy at the regional, state, and federal levels, and provides technical assistance to share best practices. Combine these different areas of practice, enable Enterprise to work on the enabling environment for affordable housing, complementing our mission-driven lending and investing. And with that, I am going to introduce our speakers. So starting with Ruby Harris, who is the Senior
Heather,
Director of...
1 second, we lost the deck somehow.
Interesting. I am not sure how that happened. Thank you. All right. So were we back? Can you see it okay? Okay, thank you. Ruby Harris is the Senior Director of Capital Solutions and Partnerships on Enterprise's Southern California team, where she supports affordable housing through developer capacity building, creative capital deployment, and policy initiatives. Before joining Enterprise, Ruby served as co-director of lending at Community Vision, a Northern California regional CDFI. She also created the Small Sites program at the Mayor's Office of Housing Community Development in San Francisco, an acquisition rehabilitation initiative that became a model for community-focused housing preservation. James Yellen serves as Grounded Solutions Network's Director of Technical Assistance, overseeing their support to the shared equity and lasting affordable housing field nationally. In his previous position as Senior Program Director at Enterprise, he focused on the role that community ownership can play in advancing economic opportunity, resident power building, and a sense of belonging. He has served on several advisory bodies and boards related to community ownership models, including at the Illinois Community Land Trust Task Force and previously at the San Francisco Community Land Trust. Lily Thomas is the Deputy Director of Housing Community Grants Division with the Marin County Community Development Agency. She develops affordable housing policy within the unincorporated area of the county and oversees programs which provide funds for affordable housing and local community services. She oversees implementation and monitoring of the housing element of the county-wide plan, the Housing Trust Fund, and the facilitation and funding of affordable housing projects. Lily also works with Marin cities and towns on housing policy and anti-displacement policies, as well as on addressing residential patterns of segregation in Marin communities. Last but not least, Jenny Wyant is a program manager at the City of Berkeley's Health, Housing, and Community Services Department and has been working with the city for over 10 years. In her current role, Jenny oversees the housing development and asset management teams and manages the Housing Trust Fund and Small Sites programs. Jenny previously worked at Habitat for Humanity East Bay, Silicon Valley as a project manager for their acquisition rehabilitation program. So we are really excited to be sharing with you. We have a rock star presentation lineup, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ruby.
Thank you, Heather, and hi, everyone. I'm excited to share with you what we've been up to for the last couple of years while we've been hosting a public sector peer learning cohort across the state. So I first wanted to ground us in what we're talking about here, because it is specifically about unsubsidized affordable housing, which many people call NOAA. Naturally occurring affordable housing. These are privately owned, unsubsidized properties that are at risk of loss of affordability and whose residents are facing displacement. So just wanted to make sure that while all types of preservation are important, this is what we focused on for the purposes of this cohort. Next slide. And also wanted to ground us on where we've been here in California. Heather mentioned the Small Sites program, which we got started in 2014 in San Francisco. And you can see here the trajectory where over the years we've been building and building in California a whole ecosystem around unsubsidized affordable housing preservation, including collecting data like CHP has been doing, piloting new programs across Oakland, Berkeley, and in Los Angeles County. We also have a number of capacity building webinars and workshops, toolkits that have been coming out. And so the public sector cohort was a natural progression of some of that work that's been happening statewide over the last 12 years now. Next slide. This is another way of looking at it. So you can see 2014, Small Sites was started with just $3 million. So you can start small, everyone. One jurisdiction and about 12 active CLTs in the state at that time. And then since then, we've had over $436 million released for this type of preservation in the state of California that we know of. 9 separate jurisdictions are all working on preservation programs and about 27 active CLTs. And then we did another quick scan in 2025 and are sort of thinking forward. So at that time, there was 283 million released or about to be released. To be determined how many jurisdictions that will cover, and then over 40 active CLTs. So you can see sort of the growth and inertia happening here in California. Next slide. So like I mentioned, the public sector cohort was the natural progression of some of our preservation work here. What we were hearing in our interactions with developers was that, hey, we really appreciate all of the capacity building and grant making that you've been doing for us to be able to know how to do these types of projects, but we really can't get anywhere without public sector in the room and more of these programs and subsidy programs getting launching. So it was also a really good time for the first round of preservation guidelines, those sort of older program guidelines, to be revisited and reimagined given current market conditions as the preservation programming matured. And then finally, a lot of different jurisdictions were finding that we're including this type of programming into their housing elements. So there was a general interest in starting to engage on that as they built their programs out. So the public sector cohort, next slide, is statewide, like I mentioned. We're really grateful to be able to work with 27 dedicated jurisdictions across the state, Central Valley, Southern California, and Northern California, all represented. We were also really lucky to have a number of jurisdictions that represented different types of jurisdictions. So we had city, city, county, and then we also had some state representation in there. We had transportation authorities, housing authorities, and even COGS all represented. So it was really nice to be able to have this conversation across the cohort. Next slide, you can actually skip to, yeah. So to give you a sense of who the cohort who they were, is that about half of them indicated that they had some experience doing this type of preservation. About a quarter had lots of experience, and about a quarter had no experience or didn't answer it. So we're assuming those are also no experience in that case. But it was, so to give you a sense of sort of, it was a good mixture of folks to talk through and do this peer learning exercise with. Similarly, most of them were interested in small to medium-sized projects, so less than 50 unit projects that were already built in part of the built environment in their jurisdiction. Some were also interested in the preservation of larger buildings over 50 units, and then followed by mobile home park preservation and single-family home preservation. And then to go into a little bit more of their goals when they were coming into the program, the biggest chunk of them were interested in preventing displacement. So that goes right along with what we were also interested in this. So you see over half of them indicated that they wanted to prevent displacement, and about half of that number wanted to support CLTs and community ownership strategies. Next slide. So these next couple of slides really are an overview of what we did. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because I want to get into the lessons learned piece of this. But I did want to highlight that in addition to 6 virtual sessions, we also did 2 in-person sessions regionally so that we could all meet each other and discuss the issues together. So the first one back. I'm going to quickly, the first virtual session was on financing, and we actually talked about all kinds of different financing that are available for this type of project and created a preservation funding matrix. Oh, and I also wanted to mention that all of the tools I'm mentioning here today, we can certainly share with you, and we're happy to do so. Just let us know in the chat if you'd like us to send it to you. Happy to do so. Session 2, we focused in on pro-preservation policy and had a lot of different examples across the state of preservation policies the jurisdictions are implementing in order to support this type of preservation. And we also created a preservation policy tracker, which tracks everything that's happening here in California related to this preservation type. Session 3, we started to get into the details about how to underwrite your developers, how to think about emerging developers, joint venture partnerships, and also as a jurisdiction, what type of portfolio diversification makes sense in order to ensure that your entire portfolio feels healthy. And that's really from the jurisdiction level. A couple of resources there were the organizational sustainability and business planning resource. And then we also had a decarbonizing unsubsidized affordable housing report that we shared. Next. The next 2 sessions were deep dives. So there's no way I can go through all of this with you on program design, but some of the lessons learned are definitely some of the highlights, the high-level highlights from those 2. And then James, one of our other speakers today, is going to go into a bit of the details, a little bit more detail with you on it. James is with Grounded Solutions Network, and they also created a Performa tool to help local jurisdictions really estimate how much subsidy will be needed in order to carry out their program goals. And then finally, session 6 focused on community ownership models, including co-ops, community land trusts, traditional home ownership, mobile home ownership, and then local renter owners, which is commonly referred to as mom and pop landlord strategies. Next slide. So now I'm going to get into a little bit of some high-level recommendations that came out of this 1.5-year long process that we all went through together. And so the first one definitely will not surprise you. The first set of recommendations has to do with making sure that your rehab budgets are realistic. This continues to be one of the hardest challenges when we're talking about unsubsidized preservation. Many of the buildings are not in the best shape. And you'll remember that they're all occupied rehabs, and so they create their own set of challenges. And And so the recommendations here are to make sure to conduct more comprehensive due diligence early on. This is also often a challenge because of quick acquisition timelines. And because of that, it's really important to increase construction contingencies when you're underwriting these projects. We are recommending anywhere from 20 to 25% construction contingency, which I know sounds really high, but is realistic for these projects. And if you have too much contingency, you'll need it down the road for these projects anyway. Aligning your per unit subsidies to be realistic. Again, these projects are generally not going to be tax credit projects. They're generally not going to have many other sources besides subsidy in them. So subsidy is carrying a heavy load of these project budgets. And generally, the per unit subsidy tends to be much higher than for those reasons than you would see in projects that have other types of capital that they can access. So that's paying for capitalized operating reserves, capitalized replacement reserves, any kind of developer fee is all sort of coming out of the subsidy bucket. So keeping that in mind. Another idea that came out of our group is for cities and counties to reserve a flexible sort of pool of money that can be used for their small sites portfolio. A pool that isn't just attached to a specific project, but that can be used across the portfolio when there are major overruns. And that will give peace of mind to the sponsors and the other lenders that are in these deals. And then finally, leveraging electrification and energy efficiency funding during rehab to bring down the reliance on public subsidy. Next, we're going to talk about capacity. This was also a hot topic throughout the cohort. We talked a lot about how to best support lower capacity or organizations that haven't done a lot of this type of work in the past. And so some of the core solutions that we recommend is that partners work with CDFIs to reduce public sector burden as much as possible. This, again, isn't always possible. Income streams tend to be limited, and so that doesn't support that much debt in general. But to the extent possible, always important to have CDFIs in the room. Encourage joint venture partnerships and technical assistance. So one of our recommendations here is actually to have a grant program that runs alongside the capital program for the projects. That grant program will go towards technical assistance and also support the ongoing capacity of both the senior partner and the emerging developer in these joint venture partnerships. Use contractors to fill capacity gaps. That can include a variety of different things. We have a few listed here. And then finally, for jurisdictions to consider diversifying their preservation awards over many organizations instead of just one. So one of the things that we've seen happen at some jurisdictions is that their small sites portfolio is very highly concentrated with one or two organizations. And so it can cause issues within the portfolio if there's any issue with that organization. Next slide. Next, we're going to talk about operating budgets. These smaller properties tend to have a harder time being flexible when their operating budget changes, especially as we've seen over the last several years. And so really making sure that you're allowing capitalized operating reserves is important. Encouraging mixed income models where it is possible is really important. We know that not all nonprofit sponsors are as interested, but there are different types of mixed income. It doesn't have to be market rate. It's just a way to better cross-subsidize the lower income units so they operate better. Underwrite projects assuming some property tax liability. This has been an ongoing issue, especially with these smaller sites, but also with our larger sites. James will go into a little bit more detail about some of the trends that he saw in his research. And then we are also seeing a trend where jurisdictions are now allowing higher performing projects to cross-subsidize deficit projects where there is like a sole funder and they have some ability to do that. And then finally, as far as lessons learned, there are other ways besides capital for public sector to play a role in helping these projects happen. One of them, so I'm going to run through these really quick. One of them is to coordinate across agencies within your jurisdiction. So, as an example, and especially it was really evident when we were working with local rental owners or mom and pop landlords. When you have, different inspectors coming at different times to try to track and give approvals on your small rehab project. Those rehab projects can change and morph over time when you have other different people. So that's like one example of how a city or public agency can help out with making things more streamlined for these small developers who can't really respond to those kinds of changes on a dime. Support limited equity ownership conversion. This conversation has to happen early. And for public sector subsidy providers, having that conversation with your sponsor early, what are their long-term strategies for the building? Many of our developers want to be able to convert to co-op ownership or tenancies in common, and the deed restrictions applied to their buildings need to match with that expectation. There's also a role for public sector to connect sponsors to partners like lenders, funders, other JV partners, and sellers. Adjusting compliance requirements for smaller properties. This is a really big one. Again, these are working on super thin margins, and so smaller properties just can't comply to the same level that larger properties are able to for certain compliance. That includes both reporting and financially. It creates a strain on these properties. So adjusting them down or just to be right-sized for a smaller property type would be very, very helpful. And finally, adopting pro-preservation local policies like the community ownership or tenant ownership to purchase acts, or considering transfer tax reductions for nonprofit acquisitions are all different ideas that have come up in our cohort. Next slide. So just to give you a sense of the outcome of the cohort, of the 27, 24 jurisdictions reported increased technical knowledge related to the topic. 20 jurisdictions built stronger relationships and really worked with the peers that were in the cohort as they were creating their acquisition strategies. 11 jurisdictions have developed new preservation policies and programs as a result of their participation, and 5 jurisdictions also deployed preservation funding during this time period. And finally, so what's next? As Enterprise, we're going to continue to be dedicated to this. It's really important to us that we're supporting people to be able to stay in their neighborhood as much as possible, and also to be able to preserve what housing we do have. So we plan to continue doing both public sector and developer-oriented conversations throughout the years around this topic. In Los Angeles, we are also going to be providing TA through our new housing authority down here. We are also working on a publication that will detail more details than we're going to be able to share in this hour-and-a-half webinar about the public sector cohort, and we hope to have that published this year. And we're going to continue to advocate for local and state funding sources and any kind of administrative reforms that are necessary. So please feel free to reach out to us as things come up. And on the right column is what's going on right now related to in California related to some of these policies. So we've got AB 670, which enables jurisdictions to count ACT rehab towards their RENA goals. We are working on the Community Anti-Displacement Preservation Program as part of the state housing bond, which will be huge to be able to have some state financing for all of the jurisdictions that don't have capacity to do their own financing. We've got SB 1091 making its way through, which enables CAP. And then we're working closely with our developers and our tax credit team on trying to make sure that more of those tax credits are going towards the ACT rehab style projects. And with that, I'm going to close my part of the presentation and pass it over to my colleague, James.
Thank you, Ruby. Awesome to hear about all the great work y'all are doing in California. Uh, I think Heather mentioned this. I used to work at Enterprise out of the San Francisco office and lived in California for many years. So it's nice to sort of be back, having an opportunity to talk about this topic, which I care so deeply about, and also see a lot of familiar faces in the chat. Can everyone see my screen okay? I can launch into things. I think so. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. Great. So, as Heather mentioned, my name is James Yellen. I'm the Director of Technical Assistance at Grounded Solutions Network, now based in Chicago. For those who don't know, Grounded Solutions Network is a national nonprofit organization that focuses specifically on what we call lasting affordable housing. So, housing that is intended to remain affordable for many generations to come, including community land trusts, deed restricted home ownership. We do a lot of work on local inclusionary housing programs, among other strategies. We are a member-based organization, about 250 to 300 members strong, covering pretty much the entire country. And we do a lot of different things to support the field, in some ways paralleling some of the things Enterprise does, but a much smaller organization and much more focused on these specific models. So I represent the technical assistance team. We work with jurisdictions, local nonprofit organizations, housing developers, philanthropy, et cetera, all around the country to design and launch shared equity programs. We also do research, we do finance, we do policy at the state, local, and federal levels. We have trainings and online resources. We don't have a ton of time to go into the things we do, but we'll share some resources for anyone that's interested in learning more about grounded solutions and some of the things that we offer. For this particular project, I was really excited and happy to get to collaborate with some of my former colleagues at Enterprise on their public sector preservation cohort. And in this case, we called upon both my team and our innovative finance team, which deals more with capital, pro formas, real estate development topics. So we were brought in specifically to help collect and aggregate actual project costs across the state through looking at pro formas as well as public data and not so public data on market transactions in the small to medium multifamily rental market. We conducted qualitative analysis to better understand the context behind these numbers, to understand what kinds of conditions and dynamics were at play. Um, we developed a tool that we'll talk about a little bit later that will hopefully help public sector staff that are creating or refining an acquisition rehab program to model different funding scenarios, look at how different project cost assumptions impact their numbers, look at how income levels impact their numbers across an entire program portfolio so that they can make informed policy and program design decisions as they implement the lessons that they learned in the cohort. And one of the things that we made sure to do as an organization that focuses on not just rental, but also alternative ownership models, in that tool, you can sort of look at not just what does it look like to maintain affordable rents as they are, but how might it look to preserve or convert those homes into shared equity models like a land trust or single family home ownership or a housing co-op. But I'm going to start with the research we did on the field on the state of housing preservation in California. The first thing we did is acknowledge that California is a very diverse state in many, many ways, including its housing markets. So looking at the participants in Enterprise's cohort, we created these sort of four broad and kind of crude buckets to describe who we were working with and what kinds of market conditions one might expect around the country, around the state. I know everyone here, or most people here, are coming from the Bay Area, so you're not shouldn't be surprised to see that kind of became a category all its own as the highest cost part of the state, where labor supply is tight, where housing prices are high, where displacement is acute, and where there are restrictive regulations around construction that can sometimes exacerbate those challenges. And then it kind of goes down the line from places in LA and the surrounding region that are ever so moderately more affordable, slightly less restrictive, slightly lower development costs, but not significantly so, and on until you get to some of the more interior or suburban parts of the state, where again, there's this relationship between cost, affordability, restrictive development environments, and also the displacement dynamic changes, right? From the areas that are pricing out many folks to the areas that are increasingly receiving those folks that are forced to relocate and where housing prices are again starting to get pushed up. And I think you all know very well what that story looks like in the communities you represent. But we just wanted to make sure that as we looked at projects, as we looked at policy environments, as we looked at the numbers around costs, we were being mindful of the different local conditions that might explain or impact those numbers. As I mentioned, we used a mixed methods approach. So in addition to collecting over 35 pro formas on recently completed acquisition rehab projects around the state of California, we also conducted semi-structured long-form interviews with 11 different agencies and developers, nonprofits, et cetera. So 11 entities, but probably more like 15 or 20 individuals were participating in these interviews. They range from places like City of San Francisco and LA County to community land trusts and smaller nonprofit developers to a handful of larger nonprofit developers that are operating at a higher scale. We also looked at some of the recent transaction data from the MLS and CoStar, although we found that to be less impactful or less relevant to our ultimate analysis and tool than we originally thought. As you'll see when I get into the tool, you'll see a lot of the costs that we're sharing there come from real life acquisition rehab projects because we felt that that was a little bit more illustrative of what these projects tend to look like, even though there's very, very high variability. And so I'm going to start by talking about some of the themes that came out of our interviews. I think this is where a lot of the richest data emerged. And in many ways, it sort of reinforces and validates the things that Ruby was speaking to, the things that were focused on throughout the cohort, from what I understand. But first, starting with construction, um, perhaps unsurprisingly, what we heard across every market, every condition, was that construction was highly variable. There was always deferred maintenance that was very difficult to predict what the cost would end up being. We also saw that capital needs assessments, or sort of this early due diligence work that folks were conducting, often dramatically underestimated the actual rehab costs. So that's our first cautionary note is take those CNAs and PNAs with a grain of salt when you're putting together your funding application, your construction budget. It's unfortunately the case that you don't really know what you're getting into until you've conducted significant on-site inspections and even done some destructive testing or start to actually do rehab work. As you can see in the quote here, this is from a very large nonprofit developer with a lot of experience. Even with the best due diligence, you were never on the same budget 12 months later. You open the walls and you find more problems. That was, again, a theme that we heard over and over again, opening the walls, finding hidden gems that end up increasing your costs in significant ways due to dry rot, due to structural issues that were not previously anticipated. We also know, as Ruby also mentioned, this is even more so the case in smaller buildings where you lack the scale to spread some of those unexpected costs across a larger project budget. Sometimes these smaller buildings also require customized work because of the fixtures and furniture and older buildings that have quirky conditions and shapes. So there's a lot of customization that has to end up happening over the course of the development. And like everything, experience matters. The more experienced developers had developed processes to sort of anticipate these needs and refine their estimates, to bring in trusted contractors and other partners early in the process. In some cases, working with tenants or developing their tenant outreach work to get more information on building insights. So again, having a development partner with experience or having done this work a lot yourself is going to make a big difference in estimating those costs. I think everyone here also is probably pretty aware of some of the regulatory and financial challenges in California. So one of the things that comes up a lot with these smaller rehab projects is that despite their scale and the fact that a lot of these laws and rules were not necessarily written with these projects in mind, they do tend to be subject to things like prevailing wage. This is further complicated by the fact that each city that sometimes, you have a developer operating in multiple cities within the same region, but the funding that they're going after comes with different requirements, whether it is prevailing wage, which for those that don't know is essentially paying union scale wages, whether or not you're using union labor. It might be local hiring requirements, minority and women-owned business requirements, all very important, well-intended policy goals and requirements, but really more designed for the larger scale, LIHTC finance developments that can actually afford some of those higher costs. The margins on these smaller projects are just make it very difficult. And beyond that, actually finding contractors that can comply with all of these requirements and want to do a smaller scale job can be very difficult. So it limits the labor pool, again, driving up costs because you have fewer options to choose from. On the welfare exemption side, every developer that is working on these projects views the welfare exemption as foundational to the project feasibility. It's a huge part of the operating expense that you're able to either reduce or completely eliminate. However, delays, inconsistent interpretations of the rule, restrictive county level policies, especially in places like the Bay Area, create major risks. So it makes it difficult to actually count on that property tax relief coming in a timely manner. So folks are having to front fund sometimes up to 2 years of 3 years of property taxes, just in anticipation of a slow process of getting the exemption. Another big operating cost we heard a lot about that we're hearing everywhere, it's all over the news, especially in places like California, is insurance. Utilities, staffing, compliance costs, these are all factoring into increasing operating expenses, but insurance is a big one. Every single developer, we spoke to, I believe, 7 different developers of different sizes. Every one of them mentioned insurance. It's unpredictable. You have new hazards you have to factor in, fire, obviously, seismic insurance, flooding insurance, depending on where you are in the state. Sometimes insurance requirements also trigger things like costly electrical panel upgrades or health and safety upgrades that have to be made to the building that maybe were not originally anticipated. So this is a growing issue. You can see in the quote here, the average insurance costs were almost tripling or more than tripling in some cases. And obviously that's going up much faster than rents are being modeled for these projects. And of course, preservation is all about keeping tenants in place, but doing repairs on these properties may require relocating folks, and California has fairly stringent relocation laws at the state level, and these can quickly get pretty out of hand. As you can see in the quote here, this is from a project in Oakland, finding out that they're required not only to not charge for the relocation rent for the unit, but they're also not paying for their existing units rent. So in this case, they're taking a huge hit on both sides, not collecting, and then also having to pay for the temporary relocation and rents for the residents they were working with. So this is a really important thing to plan for ahead of time, have a relocation plan in place. A lot of folks work with relocation consultants, having strong communications with building manager, property management, resident service providers, ideally checkerboarding within the building, something you see people doing, like relocating folks within vacant units. But again, this is something we heard a lot about both from the public agency side and the developer side. And then finally, I'll try to be quick here because I think this echoes a lot of what Ruby was saying. But across the state, developers that are trying to do this work are finding themselves faced with funding programs that are often not designed for small site acquisition rehab of occupied buildings. Every single one of them pretty much recommended that there would be a as of right acquisition financing tool, a rolling application of some kind, a dedicated preservation loan fund. There are different ways of doing it, but every one we spoke to recommended that jurisdictions put that in place. The quote here illustrates how, for a lot of these folks, they're competing with much larger new construction projects that are shovel ready, that don't have the same unpredictability of an acquisition rehab project, which often come up opportunistically and are not something that you can plan for years in advance and get all of your entitlements and get ready to go. You're responding to opportunities on the market. So it creates some challenges there. So I think I'm going to skip over some of this stuff because I think Ruby covered a lot of it. We came up with a lot of best practices, both for developers and public agencies. Um, just quickly to re-echo what Ruby shared, rigorous pre-development estimates is extremely helpful. Having a good partner in place to do that, having a good process in place to do that, and planning for the insurance volatility, planning for a welfare exemption delay, a lot of the things that I just discussed, basically just getting ahead of that and factoring that in and being really brutally honest and realistic and practical with your pro forma as early as possible. On the public agency side, again, Ruby talked about a lot of this already, but any ways to streamline the entitlement process, the approval process, the tax exemption process, um, trimming up any of these hiring requirements so that they actually are workable and make sense for the scale of smaller acquisition rehab projects, and continuing to support public sector and nonprofit capacity building, which is why the cohort that Enterprise is leading is so important. So I'm going to quickly talk about some of the quantitative findings from the pro forma analysis that we did, and more importantly, just kind of indicate how that shows up in the tool. So here you can see a graph that tries to show both operating expenses and development cost expenses across these four market types that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation. As you can see from the top right sample overview, most of the projects, we got a huge trove of projects from San Francisco where they've been doing this for many years, but also Oakland, Berkeley. So that our sample is a little bit biased in that direction as well as that LA area. But you can start to see some trends emerge, and the costs, both on the development and operating side, break down more or less how you'd expect in terms of, the Bay Area and LA having higher both development and operating costs, with the Bay Area just being far and away compared to the state as a whole. And then lower cost interior parts of the state, again, seeing lower costs across the board. Interestingly, a lot of these properties, perhaps unexpected or expectedly, they aged around 1959, so you're talking about 60 plus year old properties. The average size was 22 units, the median was 9 units, so they definitely skewed more towards the lower end of the spectrum, serving as well 60% AMI households for the most part. And we saw pretty significant AMI variability as well, but 60% is right around where the vast majority of these are serving folks. One thing we did with the tool that you'll be able to check out, and it'll be available to anyone that's interested, we actually tried to break down what are the components of hard costs and operating costs from the pro formas and from conversations with folks. And you could see it's highly variable again, but structural improvements were the number one cost that we saw in the pro forma, on top of the the very descriptive other category, which basically includes everything that's not listed here. But structural, anything involving the frame, foundation, was a major factor in development costs. And then on the operating side, taxes, utilities, way up there, payroll for both staff and property management playing a big role in operating expenses. And you can see while insurance is not a huge percentage of all of operating expenses, the fact that that slice is increasing at such a rapid rate is what the real problem is here and what the real threat to the feasibility of these projects is. And this is just a screenshot of one section of the tool. We don't have time to demo it right now. I want to get to the local practitioners in some of the cities in the Bay Area that can speak more to their experience in a minute. But for those that want to check out the tool, it allows you to model out lots of different scenarios, put in different assumptions and estimates on purchase price, factors. All of the raw cost data from the pro formas we collected can be found there. And we broke it out by these submarkets and did various cross tabulations. So if you're in a given city, in a given market condition, you can kind of reference those numbers to sort of ground truth what you're seeing, and play around with some like closer to true to life estimates on the development and operating expense side. And we included a lot of different toggles and customizations in there so you can model out, what happens if we have a prevailing wage policy in which we have found to increase costs somewhere in the range of 20% on hard costs, 30%. Like how does that impact your feasibility? How does that flow through the project as well as the portfolio of projects that you're funding? What happens if you allow developer fees to be 5% versus 10%, or you require a 10% versus 20% hard cost contingency. All of those different scenarios can be modeled out pretty quickly. And this screenshot is one of the tabs in the tool that just gives you a high-level overview of how those funds are allocated by AMI as well as by property or development type. So as I mentioned earlier, rentals, co-ops, multifamily homeownership, single-family homeownership. The tool is designed to help you compare across so you can model those different scenarios and then see how they show up in the breakdown of costs, the AMIs you're serving, how much subsidy is required, etc. So I know I went over a lot of information and still somehow went over time, but hopefully this was helpful for folks. And you have my email. I think there will be some links shared in the chat. And yeah, happy to answer any questions at the end of the session here if anyone wants to chat about the tool or some of the research we conducted. And so then I am going to hand it off. I'll stop sharing my screen. And I believe Lily is going to be coming up next.
Sorry, good afternoon, everybody. Happy Affordable Housing Month. I was just thinking that it's such an important issue, particularly in California, that we get a whole month to celebrate it. Um, and I am going to give you, to start, just kind of give you an overview about the County of Marin's housing landscape, kind of what we're doing in preservation, some lessons learned, and then talk about this network that we are exploring right now. So to start, just kind of looking at our housing market, most of our housing is single unit housing, and not surprisingly, it's been really difficult in the past to develop multi-unit housing in the county. I would say that is changing with the new landscape of kind of state law, but there has been prevention, a lot of policies prevented developing multi-unit housing. So we've ended up with most of our housing as single unit housing. And not surprisingly, we also have really high housing costs. So you can see the kind of percent change in the last 10 years, but a single unit home is close to $2 million for our average cost. And when you look at rents, also again, not surprisingly, our rents are really high. And kind of interestingly, when you look at the volatility of rents, our rents tend to be less volatile. And mostly have just gone up and less kind of up and down as some of the other counties in the Bay Area. And then just a little bit about the developers in Marin. Probably like a lot of other communities, most new affordable housing is developed primarily by our larger regional affordable housing developers, which is a very important part, and we need a lot more housing, particularly multi-unit housing. But also we have a lot of land trusts and emerging developers who are kind of in the preservation area, mostly focused on preservation. And it's really a tool, as Ruby talked about earlier, as an anti-displacement tool, and that has really been the focus of it. And I think that that's why so many of these community housing organizations are so focused on it, because it's a way of protecting our communities, preventing displacement, particularly because most of the tenant protections that James talks about are not in effect in our community, just the statewide ones. So the County of Marin has a number of different housing funding sources, from locally generated funds to state and federal, and most of them can be used for either new construction or preservation, although we don't have the best practice that was mentioned earlier where we have a specific set aside for preservation. Most of our funds can be used for preservation. And you can see that over the years, we have done increasingly more of kind of acquisition and conversion. And when we talk about conversion, our data, it means conversion from non-residential to residential, and acquisition is kind of conversion from market rate to deed restricted affordable. And a little more about our land trust. I think Ruby said that there was, in her presentation, said that there was 40 land trusts around the state. Well, we have 5 of them here in our little county, and they're very kind of hyper local with a very specific geographical area that they serve. And again, I think they're coming out of that anti-displacement work where they have grown into that space as a way of kind of preventing displacement in their very specific communities. We also have a number, at least 5 kind of emerging organizations, emerging housing organizations, and those are like nonprofits that have another mission, but are now kind of stepping into the housing space, even though it's not their primary focus. And so each of these organizations has to figure out funding, acquisition, development, asset management responsibilities. And it's interesting, when I was listening to James talk about all of the challenges that he identified in the survey, I was like, how do we ever get any of these? How do these small organizations particularly ever get any of these done? Because it's a difficult landscape to be in. So I would say one of the outcomes of all of those complexities is that my team, we have a very small team, but they end up doing a lot of technical assistance, particularly around, on a whole range of things, from funding, acquisition, fair housing compliance, asset management. We have a lot of our community is on septic, so the septic is a continual part of our conversation, particularly in the western rural part of our county. And so we end up doing, a lot of that work. A lot of our time is spent on that. And a couple of things I just wanted to highlight on some of the areas that we felt like have been really successful are these collaborations with the small organizations and a larger developer. One of these examples is this one with the Community Land Trust of West Marin and Eden Housing, and the county acquired a site which was Coast Guard housing, and these Clam and Eden responded to our RFP and were awarded, and it has been a really successful model because Clam is bringing the community support, the relationships that they have both with local electeds, other community members, and then Eden is bringing that expertise and addressing some of the complexities that James mentioned earlier in the development process that we have in the county. So I think that this has been a really successful model for preservation in our community. Another example of this has been Bolinas Community Land Trust and Habitat for Humanity, or Habitat Greater San Francisco area, and they have done some home ownership in the community of Bolinas through their partnership. So that again has been that model with the land trust bringing that local community support, and then the larger regional developer bringing their expertise. And then I wanted to just pause and talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned that from the cohort, that the public sector cohort. Some of the things that both Ruby and James talked about, kind of some flexibility, more money in it. But I think I already knew those things. I would say that my biggest takeaway was really kind of truthing the amount of staff time that is invested, and normalizing it, like, oh, we're not outside of what is expected and what's normal when we're doing these preservations. So I think that was actually my greatest takeaway, was that just kind of normalizing the staff time investment that we have. And kind of related to the amount of staff time that we have invested in these smaller organizations and preservation, and these challenges with capacity and funding, our housing element had a program to think about, is there ways that we could streamline, that we could build capacity? And then our racial equity action plan called for a countywide land trust. So it was really intended to address parts of the county that were not covered. So San Rafael and Novato, our largest cities, where most of our rental housing is concentrated and which are most at risk of displacement, were not covered by one of those 5 land trusts that I talked about. And so we contracted with the San Francisco Land Trust, a partner that's kind of trusted by other land trusts, to look at is there a way that we could work better together? And out of that process, they did a needs assessment to do it. And we are now working with a steering committee who's kind of helping to guide that process. Heather has been gracious to participate on that steering committee. And it's evolved that we're not looking at a countywide land trust, we're looking at a network. So in addition to looking at ways that we can streamline the administrative process, providing technical assistance to the other existing land trusts, and looking at a hub and spoke model. And I would say that while this is kind of it's in the works still, we're hoping that what comes out of it, or what I'm hoping comes out of it, is, this hub and spoke with some expertise developed through the network, with, more support, so that each organization doesn't have to develop all of those expertises that James mentioned, and addressing all the difficulties in developing in California, and that can be more concentrated, making more funds available, spending less on admin, and being able to invest our funding more directly in preservation and ongoing asset management. And I would say that while the network is an evolving project, I think it could be a lesson learned for other housing, for other communities that have small housing organizations. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny Wyant with the City of Berkeley, and we'll do questions after.
Thank you, Lily. Hi, everybody, and happy Affordable Housing Month. I'm Jenny Wyant. I'm a program manager with the City of Berkeley. I wasn't officially in the public sector cohort, but was an honorary member and spoke to the group last year about Berkeley's Small Sites program. I've worked on our program development and implementation and was the project manager for our first 2 small sites projects. And today I'll just share an overview of our program, how we got here, how things are going, and what's next for Berkeley. So our program grew out of a referral from our then mayor, who was inspired by the work happening in San Francisco and wanted to explore the feasibility of a small sites program in Berkeley. So staff undertook some due diligence and modeling to understand what that could look like. And council allocated the first funding in 2017 and formally established the program in 2018. And so far we've issued 4 notices of funding availability, ranging from $1 million to $5 million. This is just a high-level overview of our program requirements. If you know San Francisco's program circa 2018, these should look familiar, so thank you, Ruby. The program is geared towards smaller projects with up to 25 units, and affordability is set at an average of 80% AMI, which is higher than our Berkeley's Housing Trust Fund program. The city subsidy varies based on the number of units in the project and the type of units. And we generally have the same loan terms as our Housing Trust Fund program, but we've tweaked some elements to better serve smaller properties with limited cash flow. We don't have an ongoing source of funding for small sites, so we've issued NOFAs when council specifically allocates funding to the program. The NOFAs are open-ended and funds are available until they're awarded to a specific project. The program is designed to be streamlined, which means we don't need funding approvals from our Housing Commission or Council. We just get city manager approval. And we aim to close within 90 days of receiving the application. This is challenging because we're trying to support market acquisitions and there are a lot of moving parts. And in this short amount of time, we're trying to underwrite the project, secure approvals, negotiate our loan documents, execute loan documents, close escrow, and disperse funding. So ideally, that means we're trying to underwrite the project and get city manager approval within the first 30 days, which means it's a really time-intensive project for staff. We've streamlined our underwriting process to the best we can, and we created a template for verifying project eligibility and for flagging potential risks. If we receive multiple applications through a NOFA, we prioritize in the order received, so first come, first served, unless we receive 2 within 10 days of each other, in which case we have criteria for prioritizing our projects. For example, we'd prioritize an occupied project over a vacant project. For developer capacity, applicants just need to have completed 1 comparable project, which is a lower experience threshold than what we require in our Housing Trust Fund program. And for rehab standards, we want to make sure the scope is backed by a third-party capital needs assessment. And we also review the reserve study to make sure that the projected scope plus the reserves will be sufficient to address the anticipated capital needs. And when we get city manager approval, we include staff's funding recommendation, as well as any exceptions to the program guidelines and specific conditions for the loan. Our very first project was Stewart Street Apartments. Bay Area Community Land Trust, or BACLT, partnered with a South Berkeley church to renovate 2 long vacant buildings on their property. There were 8 units in total, and they were in horrible condition. This is a flattering photo of the project, and pretty much everybody who saw the project said it should be demolished. But BACLT saw the potential. The city initially loaned the project $1 million, which was all of the available funding in that NOFA. But we ended up amending our loan several times in order to add funds, and our total subsidy ended up at $2.1 million. BACLT secured funding from LISC through the Bay's Future Fund, and the project was completed in 2022. I think the major challenge for this project was BACLT trying to make the project work with our limited funding that we had available. And they were overly optimistic about the condition of the property and cost to rehab. I think this also speaks to the previous comments about the CNA being insufficient and you never know what you're getting into until walls are opened. And the city didn't have in-house expertise to realize that the initial rehab estimate was insufficient. So now we require third-party construction monitors to provide that scrutiny and oversight. But in the end, I'm really glad BACLT had the vision and we're able to deliver a beautiful project. Our second project was Solano Avenue Cooperative, also with BACLT. We funded the maximum allowable under the program for a total loan of $3.9 million. And BACLT secured funds from Enterprise through the Bay Area Preservation Pilot Program. And this was completed in 2023 and also had its share of challenges. The main ones were that there was an uncooperative seller, and the seller was in the process of undertaking renovations during the transfer of the property. So BACLT's proposed scope was a bit of a moving target, so it was hard to pin that down. And then the work completed by the seller was not great, so BACLT had to redo some of that work. But again, it's a beautiful project. And one of the great things about this is that it's in an area of Berkeley where we don't have a lot of affordable housing. So even though we only have a sample size of 2 completed projects to date, I feel like we've learned a lot. And a lot of these lessons are very similar to what previous presenters have shared. I've organized our initial lessons into these 4 buckets. For program requirements, we've been able to see how some of our requirements are working or not working in practice. And so we'll be drafting updates to our small sites program later this year. For example, we've gotten feedback that the developer fee cap is low and not reflective of the amount of time and energy that it takes to complete a small sites project. And we've heard that the city's insurance and bonding requirements can be difficult for smaller contractors. For funding, we have no dedicated city source of funding, so it's hard for organizations to pursue new projects when they don't know when we'll have a new NOFA and how much will be available. Our city is continuing to struggle with a structural budget deficit, and last year council reallocated funds that we were hoping would go to small sites into balancing the budget. And while that was a one-time action, it impacted how much funding we could offer through our small sites NOFA. And then just more broadly, market rate development has slowed down, so we're getting fewer fees into our housing trust fund. So there are generally fewer housing dollars to go around, and so we're constantly competing with other housing needs. We require that our developers leverage additional non-city funding, and we found CDFIs to be ready and willing partners, but they can also be less nimble or flexible in their loan products, and some have shorter terms with relatively high interest rates, or they have stricter underwriting requirements, which may limit the amount of the loan or the timing of the loan. So that impacts the amount and timing of the rehab. For developer capacity, we have a limited number of organizations in Berkeley who are also interested in small sites program. The organizations tend to be small with limited staff and sometimes are dealing with staff turnover. They're often strong in tenant organizing, but have limited experience with major rehabs. The city does provide capacity building funding. We're actually wrapping up an RFP process right now, through which we'll award $200,000 per year as a grant for the next 2 years. It wasn't specific to small sites, but the applicants tended to be organizations that would do mainly ACT rehab work. And the funds can support staff and board development to help organizations grow to meet our experience thresholds and pursue new projects in Berkeley. And lastly, for the city, it's definitely a learning curve. It's a very time-intensive program, as I've mentioned, others have mentioned, and we have a small team. So while we're currently able to absorb the small sites work, we would need to staff up if we were in a position to fund additional projects, and especially if the city adopts TOPA or COPA down the line. Expedited closings are tough with a small team, especially when we're dealing with layers of bureaucracy. And lastly, Berkeley hasn't funded many cooperatives, so we're still learning how to do that. So what's next for Berkeley? We have our third small sites project underway. It's a 12-unit occupied project that is being developed by BACLT. And so far they've completed mold remediation and hope to start rehab soon. We also have an active NOFA for $2.5 million, which we issued in August of last year. We haven't received any applications yet, but I know our Berkeley land trusts are pursuing opportunities, so we hope we have a fourth project soon. Though the fact that we haven't received any applications, I think, is reflective of the fact that $2.5 million doesn't go that far in ACT rehab, and it limits the field of projects to properties with maybe 6 or 7 units. And as I noted, we're planning to revisit our small sites program guidelines in the coming months to incorporate lessons learned from our first few projects, and we'll also review other jurisdiction standards. And we anticipate future rounds of capacity building support to help grow our developer base. So the small sites program and preservation more broadly are a really important part of the City of Berkeley's overall housing strategy, and I hope we'll be in a position to fund many more down the line. So with that, I'll pass it back to Dominique for a quick announcement.
Thank you, Jenny, and everyone for the great presentations. I just want to share a few announcements before we head to the Q&A section. So start to think about your questions because we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. The first announcement is a free TA opportunity through Enterprises Advisors team. They are supporting local governments with reforming their land use policies. And so if you're interested, we're going to be dropping a link in the chat where you're able to learn more information. Through this program, cities are not only able to access the free TA, but also have the opportunity to network with other jurisdictions and collaborate. Secondly, here in Southern California, we will be hosting a Preservation and Partner Sustainability Symposium. This is going to take place on June 9th at the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center. The discussion is going to convene affordable housing developers, our public sector partners, and industry leaders to really discuss the future of housing preservation, as well as sustainability, and discuss innovative strategies to address the challenges that organizations are currently facing. And again, we're dropping a link in to RSVP for that. And then lastly, we want to know if you want to continue to engage with us and continue to be a part of these conversations. We plan on convening our public sector partners on a regular basis. And so we are putting a survey into the chat. If you can just complete that, yes or no, if you would like to continue to stay on our listserv, so we're going to make sure that when we have the next webinar or event that you are included and you get that information. And so now we will open the floor up for questions. So you are open to use the Q&A function, and we will open the floor now. I'll stop sharing and go from there.
Thanks, Dominique, and encouraging folks to, like Dominique said, include your questions in the chat if you have any, or also just feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question to any of our presenters directly.
Yes, Matt, you can go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. Very fascinating. I wasn't sure how much I would learn today, but I learned a lot. So thank you. I really appreciate the presentations. I have a question, James, for some of your data. I'm looking at the operating expenses breakdown, and I'm curious about the 25% going to payroll number. I was also wondering so one, could you expand a little bit upon what goes into that category in your research? And then also, did you see a variation depending on project size? Like I know from conversations with Unity Council and some of their bigger buildings, they have full-time staff at the building to do property maintenance or property management, different things, janitorial services. And so I'm curious if you saw a difference between some of the larger preservation projects and smaller CLT
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. I fear my answer is going to be very unsatisfying, but one thing I didn't say is when it comes to breaking things down into those subcategories of expenses, you got to take it with a serious grain of salt because of how few we're talking about in terms of the sample. So for one, not every project had every kind of expense or the way that, or not every project even provided their full operating expenses. So I'd have to pull up the tool again to see exactly how many projects we're talking about. But let's say you're starting with a subset of 15, and then there's really wide variability of how they categorize some of those expenses. Um, so unfortunately, making a broad claim about large projects versus small would be tough until we looked at a lot more projects. But it's a really good question. I'd like to think more about it and see if there's anything, if I can come up with a better answer for you other than just sharing the raw data. But I think your instinct is right that larger projects do tend to have more on-site staff. You're paying more for property management. You're probably paying for security. You're paying for things that you like resident services, but then it's also spread over more units. And some of those things do scale because it's a building-wide function. So yeah, sorry. I wish I had a more helpful answer for you. It's just more of an order of magnitude thing in terms of how that compares to utilities or insurance, kind of the idea behind the breakdown. But if anyone else can weigh in, I'm all ears too from your own experience. We're all dealing with small samples. That's the tricky thing.
I might jump in with another question or, kind of maybe it's more of a comment, but Lily or Jenny, if either of you want to weigh in on this, it could be particularly helpful. I think, we're in the context where lots of California jurisdictions, especially in Northern California, are dealing with budget deficits and having to rebalance their budgets. And so I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts on work that you're able to do in this kind of limited funding environment, and how you can still support preservation during this really challenging time. Does anything come to mind for you two or for others who are on this call in similar positions?
I think one thing is the capacity building grant that we're able to do. We hope to have that ongoing, but at least we have funds set aside for the next 2 years to support less experienced developers and help them get to a point where they can meet our minimum experience threshold and also hopefully have a more sustaining model.
Yeah, I would just add, right now our limited funding sources haven't been impacted, but one of the ways that we're hoping to kind of address the challenges of how much it costs and, you know, small organizations' ability to attract and compete for other funding is through this network where we have some more technical support in one place so that each organization isn't having to reinvent the wheel to hire consultants and then they go away and all that expertise that they've built goes away. And so that we're hoping that the network with the centralized administrative services really helps address some of that issue and and will help smaller organizations be able to compete for funding that they otherwise may not be eligible for.
Excellent. Thanks, all.
And I was going to just chime in again. I think the other thing we can work on is education and advocacy internally. Every housing decision is both an opportunity and a trade-off. And so just making sure our council members and city leadership understand the value in kind of each of our housing programs.
And go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, hi, this is Thomas DeFranco from the San Diego Housing Commission. I've got a question just for the entire panel or everybody here. So I was wondering if maybe somebody could speak to how they see AB 726 and AB 670 potentially influencing like local electeds or cities and their budgetary preservation programs. I think, getting RENA credit for low or very low income units is a really enticing offer from the state. And so was wondering if anybody had like heard from their local electeds about their thoughts on it, and also if anybody has received any guidance from HCD about how the reporting for those programs and the APR would work.
I can start with the local elected piece. First of all, we have not received any direction from HCD that I'm aware of yet, but kind of speaking to the RENA credit, I think it's really important as cities and counties and towns are evaluating where to put their housing dollars. They have to be thinking about RENA credit, like just because of the implications if they don't meet their RENA. Most electeds are going to be evaluating that as part of where they put their funding. So I think that having some ability to count, projects that are moved from market rate to affordable is really important from a way of advocating for that type of funding for it. Just from the reality, even though people might say, that's not going to influence it. I think it's a really important tool. We have funded acquisition pretty at all the acquisitions that have come through. Like I think that our Board of Supervisors has, but I would say over time that it's an important tool, and I think it'll help with encouraging and promoting preservation.
Yeah. Thanks, Lily. And just backing up for a second, I did share a little bit in the chat about what AB 726 and AB 670 are, but just for anyone who's not familiar with those already, AB 760 was legislation that Enterprise was a co-sponsor of that passed last year, and that as of this year will allow jurisdictions to claim a share of their RENA credit from unsubsidized affordable housing preservation. So also known as acquisition rehabilitation. And AB 726 was a California Housing Partnership bill that now enables jurisdictions to claim RENA credit for substantial rehabs of already subsidized affordable housing properties. So, both of these combined really do potentially, like Lily was saying, allow or they just incentivize jurisdictions to pay more attention and into preservation in their allocation of resources. And I think, particularly in jurisdictions where we know there's development constraints for building new affordable housing, or in jurisdictions where there's been a lot of there can be challenges sometimes with public um, support for new construction affordable housing. It does allow jurisdictions to claim a portion of their LENA credit. They're not able to completely bypass doing new construction, but they can at least get a portion of their RENA credit from these alternative strategies. Great. Any other questions or comments from the presenters?
Yes, Matt.
All right. If nobody else has a question, just to follow up, like the underlying question, James, that I was asking, which I'm curious to hear from anyone, is like, we've got 10, we have BACLT, we have 10 properties in our portfolio, and are realizing that we don't really have a great operating expense model for funding the amount of staff, like ongoing staff labor that it takes to do CLT. I think a lot of like smaller developers like CLTs get more involved with various resident things, education or support, or things that are not like really quantified in any kind of a line item or paid for from property, like from the property budget. And so I'm curious if you learned anything and looking at, operating budgets or development budgets that like could shed some light on like, oh, are there some best practices or are there areas of growth where you see like smaller developers aren't really charging what they should or could because I don't know, because CLTs just want to be friendly and like not ask for too much money. I don't know.
Yeah, I hear where you're going with that. And I would say this is partly where having a developer fee baked in is important. And, you're already doing that, I'm sure, but just working with your local agencies to make sure that it's commensurate with the amount of staff time you anticipate putting on it. And just eventually, once you have a bit of more of a portfolio, obviously just doing your best to track time that you're spending on projects and somehow figure out ways to capture that as one of your operating expenses. I would also talk to a group like Meta, or a group that has a larger portfolio that can actually like give you a better ballpark. It's hard to estimate that and put a number on it when you only have like 3 or 4 or 5 properties. But once you've got 20 or 30, like Meta does, and SFCLT for that matter, I bet they'd have a better answer for you than what I could tell you from the data. Although I will say, um, MoCD does a really good job of collecting OpEx data across their portfolio because it's as part of their annual monitoring and reporting that's required for any project. I don't know, City of Berkeley, a county Marin may have something similar, but I named San Francisco just because, again, they have so many properties now. They provided a really nice data set on their operating expenses that I did not include in the analysis explicitly because they weren't all the same projects we were looking at. But if I can get permission to share it, I'm happy to send it your way. I can take another. I might even pull it up right now while other people chime in, just to see how staff expenses came up there.
Yeah, I think this is a super important question. I think the other thing that comes to mind is having seen the city of Oakland's new guidelines for their preservation fund program, which just got re-upped in January. They actually, I believe, have developer fee categories. So if there is not a really significant rehab, the developer fee is not the same as it would be if you have a really significant rehab involved. So that does account for some of the work and labor that does go into some of these more time-intensive and staff-intensive projects. All right. A very quiet crowd today. So just wondering if there's any final questions before we close out. Right.
They're just deep
Hearing that,
in thought.
reflecting very deeply. Okay, well, in the absence of additional questions in the chat or verbally, I think we might close out a couple minutes early. Just want to say thank you so much to all of our presenters, both for your really informative presentations and also just for the work that you're doing in the trenches to make preservation a reality on the day in and day out. So thank you so much all, and we will be following up with materials from this webinar, including the links and the pro forma tool, and possibly some other materials. And we have taken down your emails for those of you who requested additional materials as well. So thank you so much.